Good day, students, and welcome to another lecture on the history of India between 1206 and 1550. Today, we will be learning about military technology and its application in the Sultanate period. Now, the question of the development of military technology and its implementation in the history of the Delhi Sultanate is a complex issue, as we see a number of technologies being developed, while in some cases previously used technologies were continued but in different forms. To best understand this matter, we should first look at the contemporary documents which can serve as sources. Some of the sources of 13th century India that throw light on military technology are, firstly, the Taj-ul-Mathir, which gave information on the use of various weapons and armors, including the defensive nature of the Rajput resistance, whose forts are described in great detail, and also the methods of siege operation. Next, we have the Fakhr-e-Mudabbir's Adab-ul-Harb wa Shuja, which is a treatise on the art of war with detailed accounts on the training of horses, arts of siege operation, uses of various weapons of war, military exercises, etc. Then we have the famous Tariq-e-Firoz-Shahi of Ziauddin Barani, which described military measures adopted by Balban and Alauddin Khalji in averting such threats by constructing and repairing forts. We also have works like the Khazain-ul-Fatah of Khizr Khan and the Kiran-us-Sadain of Amir Khusro, which are a mine of information for military history. They contain a detailed description of the weapons of war and their functions in siege operations. They also describe the structural and physical operations of the Deccan forts, which provides more knowledge about these types of forts. We also have the accounts of Ibn Battuta, who came during the reign of Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq, along with the works of Al-Umari and Kalkashindi, which help us to learn more about the military history of this period. Now that we have covered the sources, we move on to weaponry. According to historian Athar Ali, the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate ushered in a new era of military technology. The Sultanate equipped their army with both indigenous and foreign weapons. The following discussion will give us a brief overview of the military equipment used during this period. Firstly, we will discuss bows and arrows. These were offensive weapons. Delhi Sultans used various types of bows, namely the Chachi, the Khwarizmi, the Parwanchi, the Ghazniji, the Lahori, the Karori, the Hindavi, and the Kohi. The Chachi bow was most effective and was favored by the Central Asian archers. A number of varieties of arrows were used, each having its own effectiveness. The heads of the arrows were greatly responsible for inflicting different types of wounds, since they were made of different materials and were of various shapes. In India, arrows having several arrow points or barbed arrowheads were in use. Some of these arrows were also poisoned. Once the arrow pierced into the flesh, it was difficult to extract it. The arrows intended for different purposes were named accordingly. So we have the Tir-e-Partabi, which was an arrow that travelled fast. We have the Tir-e-Zira, which was meant to pass through the zira of the soldier. We have the Tir-e-Kaftan or the Tir-e-Bequitak, which were effective in piercing the armor. Amir Khusro mentions both the Kaftan and the Gultak, which were arrows manufactured with such a skill that according to Khusro, they could pierce 10 layers of heart. Now we come to swords. The swords used by the army of the Delhi Sultans possessed various types such as the Chini, Rusi, Khizri, Rumi, Firanki, Yamanj, Sulaimani Shahi, Alai Kashmiri, and Hindi. Among these, the Hindi swords were regarded as the best. These again were of various kinds, like the Padalak, the Tarawata, the Ruhina, the Makbar, the Mankauhar, and the Parmakas. The sword, called the Mauj-e-Darya, was regarded as the best among Indian swords and considered above all other swords that have been mentioned earlier. The Indian soldiers preferred to fight with the Padalak, Tarawata, and Ruhina, as these swords were hard and strong and they could inflict deep wounds. Another sword, called the Bakhari, was of Indian origin and had great appeal for the people of Khorasan and Iraq. Nibah was a sword manufactured in India which was made of soft iron along with small proportions of silver and copper. Nachak was a royal weapon which combined in its structure both the sword and the mace. Thus it was used for both slashing and smashing. The Dashna was a sword which was small in size, slightly curved and broad at the apex. Katara was a short sword used by the Indians. It had a hilt with two branches extending along the arm so as to shelter the hand. The blade was very thick with two cutting edges. Khanjar, or a dagger, which was carried by the Turks for close combat. And the Kurd was similar to a butcher's knife and used by the Afghans. The lance, or the neza, was the weapon of the Arabs and the Turks. The Khorasani and the Iraqi neza were made of willow and were used by the Central Asian warriors. But the author of the Adab-ul-Harb gives preference to the Indian lance, which was made of reed. The neza made of reed was hollow and thus very light. It travelled straight and the nezabaz seldom missed his target. Thus this long weapon could be both heavy and light. The light ones were thrown at the enemy from a distance and the heavy ones were wielded just like a sword. The battle axe and the mace were carried by the cavalrymen to use in hand-to-hand combat. The axe was primarily used to cut open the armor of the opponent, and if wielded with great force, it could fatally wound the enemy. There were many types of maces and battle axes. So, tabar, a single triangular blade, was used for cutting and smashing. The tesha and the khist were more in common with the lance than the axe. The tabarzin was the battle axe which was used by cavalrymen in an emergency. They always carried it fixed to the saddle. The gurz was basically a mace made of gold, silver, or iron. The other forms of the mace were the amud, the kopal, and the dabus. A lighter club called the dara, which had a small head on top, was also used. There were also many hand weapons, such as the durbash, a heavy baton kept by the security men of the ruler to press the mob back by holding it horizontally. The falakun, a sling by which the soldiers could throw stones at the enemies. The jak, an iron disc with sharp edges which could slice away parts of the body. The hasak, a spiked ball made of iron or wood, which was used to injure the hooves of the horses and the feet of enemy elephants. The kamand, which was used by the cavalrymen to dislodge the enemy from horseback or from the backs of war elephants. Apart from these light weapons which were used by the warriors, we have artillery. Heavy artillery was used to capture forts. The manjaniks and the aradas were mechanical artillery used to make breaches in the fort wall. As it has been described in the Adab-ul-Harb, weapons used to attack the fort were also known as the kharak and the chark. The kharak was a weapon which was used by the besiegers in making holes in the walls of the fort. It had a beam with a sharp point. The beam was supported by ropes or chains which were suspended from two big vertical posts. The beam was pulled and then released to make forceful contact with the wall. Such repeated contacts created an opening in the wall of the fortress, thus enabling the besiegers to enter into the fort. The chark worked on the mechanism of a crossbow, the only difference being that it was a huge structure which was handled by several men. It discharged very heavy arrows or javelins to a very long distance. Apart from these, as previously mentioned, there were siege engines known as the manjanik and the arada. The manjanik was a mechanical artillery which threw missiles of various types, including naphtha bottles or pots, to a very long distance to make opening in the fort wall. If hit by a manjanik stone, the victim almost never survived. Nusrat Khan was killed when hit by a Makrabi stone during the siege of Ranthambore. Barani and Amir Khusro have both mentioned Makrabi in the Tariq-e-Firoz Shahi and the Khazain-ul-Futuh, respectively. The Arada was a lighter manjanik fitted on wheels, which during a siege operation could be taken from one place to another for more effective use. Apart from these offensive weapons, armor was also an important part of military technology. The soldiers in the army protected themselves with armor made of iron and steel and also with leather jackets. The horses and elephants too were protected by defensive armor. The army of the sultans of Delhi wore various types of armor, each serving its own purpose. The head of the warriors was protected by a steel helmet called the khud. Next, the mikfar, or network of steel worn under the cap, was to protect the neck and the back. Developments in manufacture of steel led to the production of more flexible armor, which facilitated the movements of limbs and other parts of the body. Irfan Habib has argued that the invading armies were technologically superior to indigenous armies. Simon Digby, however, has argued that the invading Muslim forces showed little technological superiority. Athar Ali here has remarked that the Delhi sultans prudently took technology known in India and the Islamic world as per their requirement. The quality of war equipments manufactured in the karkhanas was regulated by the sultans themselves. For example, Qutbuddin Aibak personally supervised the manufacture of manjaniks. We should remember that warfare and technology were not just confined to North India. We must now look at technological warfare in the Deccan Plateau. And this has to focus on the use of firearms. When did firearms arrive in the Deccan Plateau? Historian Richard Eaton and Philip Wagner have made an interesting study on the introduction of firearms technology in India. It has been observed by many scholars that the advent of gunpowder technology can be dated back to the second half of the 15th century. Iqtidar Alam Khan has argued that in the second half of the 15th century, Indians were using cannons cast in brass or bronze as well as handguns. Archaeological evidence suggests that gun ports were built by the Bahmani rulers into the walls of three principal forts, Bidar, Kalyana and Raichur. Literary works bear out the evidence of the advent of gunpowder technology in the region during this period. Mahmud Gawan, the Bahmani Wazir, described how the siege of the fort of Machal was made possible by using siege cannon. Persian chronicler Firishta also mentioned that Bahmani forces used cannon like the Tup and the Zarbuzan during their siege of Belgaum, which was an ally of Vijayanagar. Firishta adds that on occasion, engineers under Gawan's command, called the Atish Bazan or the fire workers, deployed explosive mines that peoples of the Deccan had never seen before. European sources dating to the period shortly after the advent of the Portuguese also refer to the use of firearms among the local powers of the region. Gaspar Correa, Albuquerque's secretary, records that in 1502, Portuguese naval squadrons were bombarded from the hilltop overlooking the port of Bhatkal. Italian traveler Varthema recorded seeing artillery at the port of Chaul, then controlled by the Sultanate of Ahmednagar. So, it is quite clear that firearms were already in use in the Deccan. But we need to understand how they came to be there and how they were being used. Eaton and Wagner argue that this technology reached the Deccan in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. They are of the opinion that the knowledge of this technology had travelled from the Mamluk sultans of Egypt, who possessed both cannon technology and a vested interest in the lucrative spice trade from India to Europe during the latter half of the 15th century. Mahmud Gawan maintained close commercial and diplomatic relations with both Mamluk Egypt and the Ottomans. After capturing the fort of Goa, Gawan had sent Bahmani agents through Mamluk Egypt to Bursa in western Anatolia, and from there into the Ottoman Balkans to market Indian textiles. The best material evidence for this inference is the wrought iron tube cannons that still lie on the former Bahmani forts at Bidar, Medak, Yadgir, and Devarakonda. Made in two parts with separate barrel and powder chamber, these early cannons appear typologically identical to those that the Ottomans reportedly captured from the Mamluks in the late 15th or early 16th century, which are preserved in Istanbul's military museum. The presence of the Portuguese further accentuated the process of transmission of knowledge of technology. After they had conquered Goa in 1510, the Portuguese found that the Bijapuris had already established a formidable munition plant in the city. In the Battle of Chao of 1508, a group of warships belonging to Mamluk Egypt and the Sultan of Gujarat had defeated a Portuguese squadron off the Konkan coast. This was the first military reversal the Portuguese had suffered in the Indian Ocean since their arrival there a decade earlier. The Turks captured firearms from the Portuguese and took them to Goa, where they were integrated into the existing stock of the city's arsenal. Following the two naval engagements of 1508 and 1509, guns captured from the Portuguese found their way to Goa, followed by Mamluk or Ottoman gunners and gunsmiths. All of these influences considerably enriched and expanded Goa's existing firearms industry. Very high quality firearms, both cannons and matchlocks, were now part of the Goan arsenal. Gunsmiths of Goa, working under Bijapuri authority, seem to have made very high quality firearms. The Portuguese viceroy, Albuquerque, was so impressed with the gun making skills he encountered in Goa that he sent to the King of Portugal samples of the heavy cannon made by the local Muslims. In 1513, the Viceroy reported that matchlocks made by Goa's master gunsmiths were as good as those made in Bohemia in Europe. He even sent one of these gunsmiths to Lisbon to work for the Portuguese crown, presumably with a view to sharing with Portuguese military engineers the techniques in gun manufacture currently being used in Western India. Reynard Denhard speaks to an Indo-Portuguese tradition of matchlocks that were produced after 1510 in the arsenal of Portuguese Goa. This style of firearm would soon spread not only into the interior of the Deccan, but by the mid-16th century throughout Portuguese Asia as far as Japan. Now, we must perform a case study. We must look at the use of firearms in the Battle of Raichur. The remarkable achievements in gunpowder technology is best understood in the context of this battle, which happened in 1520. As Eaton and Wagner have called it, Raichur had been an early player in military modernization under both the Bahmani and the Adil Shahi administrations. Fernando Nunes reported that Raichur's Adil Shahi defenders had placed 200 heavy cannon and many smaller cannon along the curtain walls and between the fort's bastions. And on the fort's bastions, they had mounted 30 stone-hurling catapults or trabuco. Nunes also described Krishna Devaraya's advance into the Bijapur territory, in which his army consisted of swordsmen with shields, war elephants, and several cannon. Krishna Devaraya had hired 20 Portuguese matchlockmen who inflicted considerable losses on the Bijapur army. However, the Bijapur army had a huge supply of artillery. Nunes reports that this army in retreat had to abandon 400 heavy cannon, 900 gun carriages, and 4,000 war horses and 100 elephants. Eaton and Wagner have argued that the Bijapur forces at Raichur Fort deployed the new gunpowder technology in a manner that proved to be disastrous, as was their deployment of cannon in the pitched battle beside the Krishna River. In this battle, Bijapur's gunners made the tactical mistake of firing all their cannon in one volley, and they did not stagger their volleys. This meant they could not reload and keep firing successive rounds of shot quickly at the enemy. And so they were overwhelmed by Vijayanagar's swift and powerful cavalry. At the Raichur fort, Bijapur's gunners were unable to maneuver their cannon so as to screen the walls with flanking fire. Being fixed in the gun ports along the curtain walls, the cannon were virtually immobile and hence of little value against besiegers who managed to approach the wall underneath them. The military engineers' conservative approach of mounting cannon on the fort's ramparts proved to be their own undoing. Owing to the arrangements of the fort's defenses, the 30 stone-hurling catapults placed on the bastions and the hundreds of heavy and light cannon being fixed along the curtain wall in immobile firing positions meant that each shot fired from those cannons would tend to land in nearly the same area. It was predictable. As a result, Krishnadevaraya's men were able to dismantle a portion of the city wall without suffering prohibitively high casualty rates. It would have been better to have mounted the heavy cannon on the bastions to provide enfilading fire, but this the Bijapur artillerymen had not done. Now we should briefly take a look at military architecture. Any discussion on military technology would remain incomplete if developments in military architecture, especially in the Deccan, is not taken into consideration. Between the end of the 15th and the beginning of the 16th century, new principles of fortification developed in the Deccan. In fact, it was from the 11th century that in certain places a complex system of defense was being employed. It is based on the accumulation of obstacles, that is, the erection of a series of barriers in front of the main enclosure to keep away attackers by using natural features such as hills, a river, or artificial works on flat grounds. These successive enclosures, semicircular, circular, or ovoid in shape, multiplied the lines of defense. Some of them were ordinary banks of earth, others were levees, sometimes partly or fully equipped with stonework. Vijayanagar in the Bellary district, for example, was encircled by several barriers. Persian traveller Abdul Razak mentioned that there were 7 riveted enclosures. Portuguese traveller Domenico Paes mentioned that the town was surrounded with a discontinuous line of hills, forming several concentric circles, and that all these successive crowns represented insurmountable obstacles, except at the gates which gave access to the city. It is at Warangal that the best example of a ring-shaped enclosure can be found. To the southwest of the modern town, 3 concentric defensive lines were erected. George Mitchell suggested that this fortification was based on cosmic symbolism like the mandala, the yantra, the swastika, which corresponds to a distinctive defensive system. The 3 concentric defensive lines were made of earth and rubble, followed by an enormous concentric earthen embankment with, at intervals, bulging or flanking works, defended by a wide and deep ditch, and finally, a massive construction in granite with quadrangular towers and gates. The best preserved part is the 3rd enclosure, or the inner fort of Warangal, called the Kalukota. It is a massive circular granite construction with a perimeter of 6 kilometers, surrounded by a deep moat and flanked by 46 rectangular towers and 4 monumental gates built during the 12th century. The purpose of these gigantic earthworks was twofold. Firstly, because of the depth of the ditch and the slope of the embankment outside the enclosure, they were intended to block the impetus of the attackers and put the enemy in a position of inferiority. Secondly, because of their circular form inside the walls, they were to make the movements of the defenders easier towards the most vulnerable points during an attack. And now we come to our conclusion. Thus, this period saw widespread and innovative use of military technologies. Clearly, South Asia was not in some kind of technological stasis. Rather, the rival states were all fiercely competing against each other to gain an upper hand, and they were clearly eager to employ all sorts of military technology to achieve this end. Thank you.